that's aware. Thank you. You have to have a community that's aware of why you're doing it, of what the reasons are for, and a lot of the culture of food and food economy and land ownership have been areas where, if you know Oregon history and the history of the region, there's not a lot of us here. And was not promoted as Oregon was an apartheid state. And Black people could not buy land until 1929, which wonderfully ties into part of our advocacy work is timing. And the Cory Booker bill, which is one of the bills we worked on with local legislators, both in Washington and Oregon, the Black Farmer Relief Bill that is finally looking like it's going to be taken out of the court battle and obstructions and start to be handed out. We do a lot of that work behind the scenes, getting the Black and Indigenous community to transcend community politics and move into regional, state, and national politics in order to connect all of the different dots that economically and programmatically are directed at our community here in Oregon and Washington. So underrepresented farmers, veteran farmers, extremely low income white farmers who are a lot of our friends and collaborators in this work. We founded in 1918, I wish. We founded originally in 2018, and our 4 directors have about 50 years of food systems work. Collectively, I've been farming for 26 years in the Pacific Northwest, and our primary area of influence is the Portland metro area, including the Upper Willamette and Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas counties. And now, like I said, we're purchasing a farm in Centralia, Washington, in Lewis County. So we will be working outside of Centralia as well with some of the Washington farmers in Southwest Washington. I'm on OCSFN. There's a lot of us in our group and our other farms, Black Future Farms, the Red, Black, and Green Farm at Howell Territorial Park, working with the city and the county and the state with the PFoFF grants and PFoFF funding, getting that money out. That's also ag money. We fought hard for PFoFF dollars, and the type of grassroots, marginally involved community aspect of political advocacy and getting people to vote and to make decisions is what I'll focus on a little later today or this evening. A lot of you know me, a lot of you don't. Our website is www.blackfoodnw.org. And if you want any more information about the rest of us and all that we do, and I'll end it there. We'll get into the evening. Appreciate everybody showing up tonight.
Thanks, Eddie. Appreciate it. Well, we're going to go ahead and get Alice back on, and you guys can tag team this and talk about the reasons why it's important that your legislators hear from the farmers and food advocates that we have joining us tonight.
Where'd Alice go?
Hello. All right. So okay. I am going to pin both of us. So tonight we wanted to talk a little bit about, how Eddie and I's experience building relationships with legislators has impacted the change that we're trying to make. So I guess the first question that's kind of on my mind, and this is more actually perfect for you, Eddie, and what you were just talking about, is if you could speak a little bit more about like the importance of making yourself and your personal needs known in advocacy when you're talking about extrapolating that to your community.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So that's a good question. So let's see, pull a few things together. There's some terms that folks use and there's community organizing, right? And then there's advocacy, and then there's politicking, and the different scales of all of this. And all of these things require relationships. And also they require that you understand civics, a basic sense of civics, and who is actually in control and who's in power. So though, for me personally, I come from a family of Black Republicans from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, back when the Republicans were not the Democrat, or the Democrats were the other people, and now the Democrat, all of that stuff, right? So outside of the US framework, we have a unique approach because Black or African American or even indigenous or non-reservation, which I was not raised on in tribal nation, so because I don't have enough percentage. So in the community that I grew up in, the ability to politic or the ability to speak up and state who you were and what you needed was something that I was raised with because of my family. My grandfathers had parties all the time in their backyards for aldermen and alderwomen. I was taught that the vote is the last line of defense before we go to bullets, and that if you're a Black person or an indigenous person who has recovered or has realized who they are and where they are in this world, that this is one of the only tools that you have, and to reinforce like a group power, your individual needs, but also to remember that politicians are servants. The protocols that we approach politicians with are respectful protocols, but that does not make them powerful people. They act on our, allegedly, right? I'm speaking from grandpa. They act on our needs. And our needs, when they are stated, should be voted for or analyzed and researched by their assistants, who we pay as well. So if they are my servants and I am the master of their day, my community is the master of their purpose, of their goals, right? Should be rooted in what we need, which is what I need, because I am a community advocate who still is in the community. A lot of us as advocates become the other, right? We're like, hey, we're working for community. Well, I'm a broke farmer as well that does not own land yet, that is writing for grants and getting foundation dollars and state money to invest in the property I want to buy with an organization to benefit the community, because I haven't economically, individually been able to acquire the funds or the access to the material necessities to buy my own farm, run my own company. So in my community, we have to start programs. We have to start nonprofits. We have to create other ways to get the money without being asked who we are personally. And we have to serve the community. And that, to me, has been the most fulfilling work, not only as a member of the community, but as a human being, because I've fought for things that would not necessarily benefit me, though I hoped it to. And 20 years later, now those benefits are coming to me, and the community that Black Food Sovereignty Coalition has helped create by acting as the liaison. Some of us can do that well and talk to politicians or people who choose the political angles, or negotiate with people who need to be reminded that they are serving us. And it's important to go expose, just like I had friends I used to go to in Washington State when Washington State University and Oregon State University launched the Women in Agriculture project. And I would go, and that's how I go help other people. So I went with women friends of mine, and I listened quietly and shut my mouth. And I was working for Seattle Tilth, and I was working for Mary Embleton, and I was working for folks up in Snohomish County. And I sat around all these white women, and I took notes, and I was the intern, and I learned about advocating for a particular group, which is what I needed to do ultimately. But in 2010, as you know, people were just getting onto women in ag. So there was no such thing as Black people in ag or Native American, indigenous people in ag, other than our food justice battle, right? So as it started to convert to from food justice to equitable food development to women in ag to Spanish speakers in ag, then those relationships I created by supporting other groups and advocating for my group and also researching on how this path is working, we're now in a really good position historically. And I'll stop with this, in that dollars are now being targeted and directed specifically at Black and Indigenous people, the BIPOC movement. A lot of people were like, well, why the BIPOC thing? That was 8 years ago. You know, it dissolves the power from Indigenous people, from Black people, and it pits us against each other. I said, no, it doesn't. It's Black and Indigenous people of color, because in the Pacific Northwest specifically, those are the two primary groups that have not been addressed based on agricultural funding and financing. You have women who are not completely taken care of, but let's look at the call and all the faces on the call and look at the predominance of women in ag after 10 years, the ownership of women in land and farm business in 10 years with that focused investment, right? So same thing for Latinx, Spanish speaking communities. And now, again, we've been working with Friends of Family Farms. We've been working with the food bank. We've been working with Prosper. We've been working with Meyer Memorial Trust. And they see that, you know, so advocacy isn't just about your specific position, place, or problem. It's also understanding civics, understanding the nature of relationships, and understanding that there are always people that will support you if you support them when it's time for you to move, right? So I'll stop there, but that's I think it's a good intro.
Yeah, there was so much there that I wanted to draw out, because I think that something that you touched on that spoke to me was like, that relationship is not linear, and it's not, you know, building to an end goal. You're there to support the community as it comes, and you're also there to support folks as the moment arises. And that's something that can feel really gross about politics to me, is that there are moments that arise, but like you were saying, it's like you have been operating on a set of principles and participating and lifting up groups over time. And now you have these relationships that you've built, and you have become a resource for your community and your legislators to change the narrative on who is an Oregon farmer, a Washington farmer, a Pacific Northwest farmer. And I think that that's something super, super powerful about the type of advocacy that BFSC does, that FoFF does, that we do in this small farm space, is that we, by showing up consistently, we're changing the narrative on who the farmer archetype is when legislators think about what a farmer in Oregon looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and like becoming a resource, like when you turn that tide and you've developed that relationship, I'm sure that this has happened to you in your long career, but like there's that moment where a legislator comes to you and they're like, hey, I have to ask you about something I heard about. Or
Yep.
like, what does your community think about this? And that's, yeah. Do you want to talk about a time when that came up?
That with COVID, you know, I think a lot of people on this call, you know, watch things change during COVID. And we, two instances, one was when the Booker bill, you know, the Black Farmer Relief Bill was first kind of getting there. I had Representative Berg up in Washington, 44th district in Snohomish, African-American woman. There are 5 African-American women, I think, on the Washington State legislature. She called me up, and one of the organizations, Adasha Turner's place, Modest Family Farms up in Snohomish, they're doing aquaponics and shipping container production, beta testing or R&D. And she was like, I don't know what's going on with this thing. You know, Representative Berg wants to find out. So I was like, okay, this is cool. So, you know, so I'm like, I haven't looked at the bill. I just know it's held up, you know, like the usual kind of stuff. It's like, so here I'm explaining to these politicians, these 3 African-American women politicians. And as soon as I explain it, they completely get it. You know, they're like, oh my God, like, why aren't we participating in this? Why isn't this, who's going to hold the money? What's going to happen? So that was a good thing. I'm not in that district. Doesn't matter. She never called me back, but the Booker bill passed. So, and she signed on to it. So the other was during COVID when we were over at EcoTrust, and we just hit lockdown. We were getting ready to do we were starting emergency food deliveries to folks for reach, and buying trucks and renting U-Hauls and trying to find refrigerated trucks because they were shipping dead bodies in them and stuff, right? Blah blah blah. So all the first kind of 6 months, and then a friend of ours, Grace, who used to be with Merkley's office or Wyden, and was she with Wyden? No, she was with Merkley, and they all called. And we got a call from Equitable Giving Circle. This is right as they were getting ready to start doing food work, and or jump into it and try to do food work. And I appreciated everybody jumping into the movement, like that first few months, to varying degrees of success, because food is food. And when they called when they called that group, they wanted to see other groups. We were there at the Beeline facility already. So we sort of had a place where we could bring people, do a tour. So Merkley and Blumenauer both came on separate tours, like, how are you doing COVID response? We had 5 or 6 other Black-led organizations, people of color, folks who'd never met them before, got to be in contact with them. Brown Hope, and some folks from there with Cameron, and there were other African-American and indigenous groups that met, Seven Waters Canoe Journey, who were all at that meeting, right? So there was an exposure to Merkley and Blumenauer for sure. I could see by their faces and the staff that, like, whoa, this is not what the red looked like before. This is not what was, and it was like, oh yeah, we can do this and and these people, and this is happening. We're moving trucks. And then some of those organizations, not us, got funding, and we got an offer by the Senate Congressional Office to submit some gigantic budget byline thing with no directions. And that was the next 2 years of battle, was trying to get somebody from Blumenauer. Like, once we got in, like, they were like, hey, you can send us a budget for $30 million if you want, but they didn't tell us how to write it. So we still haven't found anybody how to, so that's our next step, is to figure out how to write a legislative line item request thing, so, and take it to the Senate and blah, blah, blah. So if anybody's done that, let me know. We checked in with Kresge Foundation. We talked to Meyer Memorial Trust. Like, we went national, like, Rafi, like, people were like, we've never done that before. I'm like, wow, this is amazing.
That's fantastic. And I think that speaks volumes for, like, one of the hardest things, especially in the agricultural space, is like getting the reallocation of resources going in the right direction. And so we're going to talk about this in the workshop later on, but that is one of the main reasons that it's so important to have this kind of like person-to-person connection with your legislator, because when they think of you as the Oregon farmer, they'll be like, okay, how do we make sure that this funding goes to that person? Oh, it might be by giving that funding to Black Food Sovereignty Coalition to distribute, or giving that funding to the Oregon Community Food Systems Network, like they did with a portion of the disaster relief funds that went out earlier this year. And I think that something that, like, when you get to be that resource for your representative, like, for example, on a state level, we do some work on a national level, but you all are much more far-reaching than FoFF in that regard. But like, we just got a call from Rep. Owen's office earlier, a couple weeks ago, to talk about water policy. And because they were getting completely stonewalled by commodity organizations, because they were like, oh my God, we can't work with conservation. We don't want to change any part of the status quo because it'll mean that all of the water will go away. But honestly, like, we're writing water checks that we can't cash here in Oregon, and we all know it. And so they came to us because they were like, we know you're an ag group that maybe is thinking about more holistic solutions, and you might have some folks who are interested in thinking about this kind of thing differently. And Rep. Owens is a Republican. And so and he represents Harney County, like the southeast corner of the state. So like, having that out there, that you are someone who works with folks across the board, can open doors that weren't open before. I think I have one example from and I want to emphasize the relationship portion and the trust portion, because I have an example from the farm worker overtime campaign that we were really FoFF had supported that in previous sessions as well. Piccoon is the one who spearheaded that. Obviously, they have all of the expertise and are closest to the community on the ground, working with farm workers across the state. And we joined their coalition, I think 2 sessions ago is when they first started running the bill, back in 2020. And we started working with them. And then we took a much more vocal stances, I guess is what we'd say, at the beginning of the session in 2022, the short session where it ultimately passed. I don't know if everyone on the call, I was talking to somebody the other day and they're like, oh yeah, what ended up happening with that? I was like, it passed, it happened. So that campaign, there was a lot of black and white language coming out of conventional ag groups that this was going to kill every family farmer in the state, in the country, everything. It was just bad overall, never going to work, everything's terrible. And that was the message that a lot of these legislators were getting, because that is the people, those are the people who have 8, 9, 10, a dozen, 15 lobbyists who are contacting them all the time and who are paid to hold relationships. And the reason that they're so trusted is because they've been there and they've been showing up and they built those relationships. And so we went to a legislator in Southern Oregon who we knew had supported us in the past, who had worked with our staff over and over again, who we love dearly, well, in a nonpartisan 501c3 kind of way, Senator Golden. And we had a meeting with him and said, you know, we polled our membership and more than 60% of our membership is in favor of this policy. We have folks who already pay overtime. It did not kill their businesses. They're prioritizing equity in their wages and giving people a good living for this skilled labor. And it's the direction we have to go for the future of our sector. And it's not optional. And that's how we feel about it. And he said, that's the first time I've heard that. You are telling me that there are farmers who support this. I believe you, and I'm changing my vote because of it. And he ended up voting in favor of it. And like, he literally said those words to me. And that was like one of the most powerful, you know, outcomes of a relationship that we've built that I can think of. And like, so that to me, getting folks to believe you when they come to you for something, or when you come to them for something rather, they believe you if they come to you, but when you go to them and they believe you, that's when the relationship is really strong.
Agreed. Yeah. And a lot of these folks don't, you know, like, what better person than the public servant to snap them into the reality of things. I think we had bumped into, maybe it was Springer or McLean or somebody at one of the meetings, and you know, I was standing there and, you know, talking, folks were talking, you know, all the women's and the bros, and I was like, all right, cool, I'm gonna say something. She was just like, so what do you do, Mr. Hill? I was like, I'm a farmer and I'm on OCSFN and I do this other stuff. And she's just, oh my goodness, tell me about it. You know, so sometimes having, you know, again, politics is politics, and knowing, and I think a lot of people who know me or have worked with me, I see Rose Highbear here as well. Hey, Rose. Folks who, and we advocated for the Green Workforce Collaborative, you know, and for Multnomah County, when John W. was, before he was the director at Multnomah, he was the intern under Kim Pope when I first met him. And Rose and I met the folks when the feds came to town in 2014, 2015, and PSEF. People were laughing at that. People were laughing at green jobs. People were laughing at, you know, a whole bunch of stuff. Small farms being in control of the world. From Oregon. And it seems like all these things are now, you know, these relationships, the ability to show that you have continuity and consistency, and that you stick to what you're saying and you deliver things, then it's nice to show up when some of these folks who have never seen a black farmer before, I guess you'd never seen a black farmer, thought it was cute, but now she donates money, $50. She's a recurring donor, $50 a month. And I've got somebody I can talk to, and, like when she said, hey, electric tractors, that's pretty crazy, huh? They stop at night. And I was like, instead of blasting her and being like, yo, you are out of your mind, Marjorie Taylor Jr., I decided to be like, no, see, actually, there's these highly complicated batteries that we can store the energy overnight, and you can run tractors and drones. It's like your son's radio controlled car. And she's like, oh, nobody ever told me that before. And I was like, okay, we're friends now. So
yeah. And I think that I know that we are getting time to go into the workshop portion of this evening, but I just wanted to hammer home something that Eddie just said, is that, having that, like you said earlier, that being the advocate can make you the other inherently. And that's super true, that like when I come to a legislator who may know FoFF but doesn't know me, and they're like, oh, you're with Friends of Family Farmers, y'all have been around, you've been here for 17 years, like, oh, like what do you want to talk about today? And then I start talking about my background, and I have been farming here in Oregon for years, and that is so validating in that moment. And that's why all of you here tonight are so important, because yes, we are so grateful that you continue to fill out our surveys and to get that power in data, where it's like we can come and say like 60% of the farmers we serve are in favor of this thing. But having you in the room, especially if it's someone who is your legislator or is on a committee making a decision about something that directly impacts you, that is going to be more impactful than someone representing an organization in the eyes of the legislator. So we're so grateful that you are here tonight, because that is something that when you build those relationships as an individual farmer with the strength of an organization like FoFF or like Black Food Sovereignty Coalition behind you, is when we can make some real change. So I'm going to hand it over to Taylor and Heather to go into our workshop session. And I'm sorry that we went over a little bit. We were just having such a great conversation. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, no problem at all. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes, I'm seeing nods. Awesome. Well, I am Heather Rockwell. I use she, her pronouns, and I work as a contract lobbyist for the Friends of Family Farmers with Taylor, who I will let introduce himself as well.
Hi folks, Taylor Sarman. I use he, him pronouns. It's great to be on. Really appreciate Eddie and Alice, that great kickoff conversation. I think is just super helpful at framing the tactical piece that I know Heather is going to spend a lot of time covering on our call today. So really appreciate you all having us and you all making some time in your night to join this call.
Yeah. So Taylor and I just wanted to kind of kick off and share a little bit about, why advocacy is important, why talking to your legislator is important, and then how to actually do that. What are some tips of how to advocate and talk to your legislator? So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to let Taylor start and kind of give you the why this is important. And then I'll kind of run you through some of the tips about, what to say and how to say it and how to prepare for talking to a legislator, because we're hoping that some of you will be able to help do that in the 2023 session. So I am going to share my screen, and I will let Taylor kind of jump in, and this is the end of my slide, so ignore that. I will let Taylor kind of jump in and talk about the why this is important.
Yeah, well, I'll just say, I think Eddie and Alice actually did a really, really great job of kind of laying the foundation for why it's important. The only thing I would really add is that, legislators, particularly in Oregon has a volunteer legislature. So lawmakers are normal people just like you. I like to think of legislators as your neighbor. They're just like people who live down the street from you, and their job really is to represent you and your community. So, and because they're normal people, they want to hear from other normal people like you all about what issues are impacting you and your community, and those that you know. And I think that that is a really important thing to keep in mind. I talk to a lot of people who are always nervous to go into legislator meetings. And then they come out of the legislator meeting and they're like, oh, wow, they went to the same high school that I did, or their kids go to school with my kids, or they live right down the street from me. So really just keeping that human-centric idea behind the fact that they're just regular people trying to do the best that they can to serve their communities. And that ties into the most important part about why it's important to advocate, because they're just normal people. They all have their own individual professional backgrounds. So our legislature is full of folks who have been teachers, who are lawyers, who have been doctors, all sorts of professions. And that's the experience that they usually bring in with them when they are legislating. And so hearing directly from people, in this case, hearing directly from farmers about issues that farmers and producers and eaters are facing helps legislators be able to make sense of all of the other things that they have to deal with during a legislative session. The other thing I would say that I think is really important, and Alice hit on this, is that legislators want to know who their constituents are. They want to connect with you all, and so it's super important. There's usually about 75,000 people in a legislative district. And I'll tell you, having worked for a legislator as a legislative staffer, not very many people reach out to their legislator. So if you are able to take that first step, I think it really helps elevate your issues that you care about with your legislator, because they can put a face to the name and the email when they hear about issues that are impacting you. So that's just a quick overview from me, but I know Heather has got a really great workshop planned. And I look forward to continuing our conversation in the breakout rooms.
Yeah, so before we get into breakout rooms, and they'll be kind of quick because I know we're bumping up to the 7 o'clock part of the agenda as well, but I'll just kind of go through really quickly some kind of principles of advocating and talking to your legislators. Things that are super important to keep in mind is that, this is all about building relationships. Having a relationship with your legislator ahead of having an ask is always a good thing. So especially as an organization, like Alice gave in an example, having that relationship with your legislator when you go talk to them really makes a difference. When you have something that you need from a friend or someone you've talked to in advance, that's different than having something you need from a stranger. So that's kind of how we think about legislative advocacy as well. And that's true of staff. So legislators, they are super important and they do a lot of good work, but they run off staff. And so a lot of times folks will go into a meeting and think, oh, I didn't actually get to talk to my senator or my representative. They stuck me with staff, but staff make things happen when it comes to the legislature. Taylor's staff, he can tell you, they keep the wheels running, they make the bills happen. And so they're equally as important to have really good relationships with. And just kind of through these quickly, treating legislators like people. Sometimes it can feel like, you're talking to a machine that hits a yes or no button on a bill, but you are really talking to people, and, they have interests and thoughts and feelings and opinions and their own personal experiences. And so we like to kind of remind people, I see Eddie laughing and nodding, remind people that they are people too. Legislators are people too, even if it doesn't feel like it. And so those are just kind of some things to keep in mind. And there's some other on here, but I'll try to move a little quickly since we're behind. Some other things to keep in mind when you're talking to a legislator is have a message and kind of stay on message. It can be really easy when you're talking with someone to kind of veer off into, other things that you have going on. But when you're talking to a legislator, especially, you usually only get 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes if you're lucky. And often there's, more than one of you on a call. So if you've only got kind of 3 minutes to share what it is that's important to your legislator, you want to make sure that you're sticking and keeping that time to your main message and making your ask really strong. So, a lot of times folks go into a legislator call ready to share their story, but then they forget that there's an ask that comes at the end of it. So those are things like that, when you do talk to a legislator, if you write your legislator, if you kind of help us in the advocacy process in session, you want to make sure you share your story and that you have an ask. Will you support this? Will you say yes to this bill? And make sure that that is really clear. And he's like, yes. Don't forget the ask.
Actually ask.
You got to make the ask. Yeah. If you have time with your legislator, you don't want to leave that meeting thinking, did I actually ask them to do what I want them to do? You want to make sure that that's really clear. And being conversational is super important with legislators, kind of back to them being people. They'll probably ask questions. That's okay. Follow up. These are all kind of things to remember. And then here's kind of some basics of how to prepare. And I'll go through these really quickly because we'll share the slides out. But, knowing what you're going to say and how long you have to say it, always super important. Often if you've got 15 minutes and there's 5 people on the call, you've got 3 minutes to say what you want to say to them. So time yourself and practice. Logistics, obviously, confirming roles is really helpful if you're in a legislator meeting. It's good to have an asker. Who's going to make the ask? Who's going to facilitate the conversation? Who's going to take notes in case the legislator has questions and you want to follow up? These are all things that we try to practice in advocacy meetings. Sharing materials in advance. So if you're asking for, if you're helping ask for funding, you might want to share materials in advance to say how this will help you, and one-pagers and those kind of things. And then again, staying on message, making sure everybody's on message and doing your research. A lot of times folks will show up to a legislator call and they'll not know who they're talking to. And it's really important, to know who is your audience. If you're meeting a Republican, you're going to talk differently than if you're meeting a Democrat. If you're meeting someone with a history of farming, you're going to talk differently than if you're meeting someone who represents, inner Portland and they've never lived outside the city. So these are all things that are really good to know ahead of time so that when you go into the call, you talk to your audience differently based on who they are. And you can look up legislator bios on this helpful webpage, OregonLegislature.gov. They list all the senators, all the representatives, the committees that they're on. A lot of them have bios about their history, what they do for a living outside of the legislature, and those are all really helpful to look up before you meet with folks. So I am gonna jump through some of these since you all can read it later and get to kind of our breakout session. And we wanted to have you all actually, while you're here, spend some time thinking about how you might actually advocate for yourself or your farm, and think through some questions in small groups. So I am going to drop in the chat. I'll stop my screen share here for a second. I am going to drop in the chat this little worksheet of kind of how to talk to your legislator. It has some of the tips that I just went through right now that you can read later, and you can hopefully open this. Oh, I gotta share it with everyone in the meeting. There you go. Hopefully you all can open this document in the chat. This is tips on how to advocate. On the first page, tips for sharing your story. And then on the second page, we have some questions for you all to start thinking about, like in small groups. So I believe that Brittany has breakout groups queued up, and we're going to send you to those in a second. And we're going to have an opportunity for just a smaller group of us to kind of go through these questions, which are, what would financial support from the state mean to you or your farm? That's something that would be really good to start thinking about, talking to your legislator about. What problems could your legislator help you solve? We're going to start asking these questions in small groups and just kind of get some time to bounce off of each other and have an opportunity for you to ask some questions. And then we're going to jump back here probably in about 10 minutes, maybe 5. We have to be fast. And then kind of move on to hearing from a legislator and their perspective about why this is important. So, Brittany, do you have breakout groups?
We're all ready to go. Unfortunately, we have about 5 minutes. Sorry, we've got
perfect
hours
we'll
and hours of info, but here we go.
We'll be fast. All right, she's going to send you to a room, and if you hit join, it'll take you there and we'll guide you through.